I described it over time as almost a little bit of a personal mourning period because it had been a dream of mine or an idea of mine that was going to be my career. And that wasn't.
Do you think of that experience as a failure?
No.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Stark Tank, the podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. This week, we sit down with Bini Maryles. Bini started out as a rabbi, but after some embarrassing mishaps, he realized it was time to change course. Already close to 30, he had to reinvent himself professionally while staying close to his values. My name is Yaakov Wolf, and this is Stark Tank. Bini Maryles, welcome to Stark Tank. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So you started out your career originally as a rabbi. Can you tell us a little bit more about what drove you to that path and what were your early roles in that career?
Yeah, well, actually started in teaching because before there were jobs available, let's say in the rabbinate, there were more jobs available in teaching. And so as much as I wanted to go into the rabbinate, I needed to be in a position to interview for those jobs and maybe get those jobs. And so I started in teaching Judaic studies at my alma mater, where I went to school at Yeshiva Flatbush High School. And then as opportunities presented themselves either as senior rabbis or assistant rabbis or whatever, I'd start to apply for those roles as they came up, if they made sense for me. I had a good relationship with the team at Yeshiva University where I studied in terms of placement. And then when the right opportunities would come, we would talk about perhaps interviewing, and I started to interview for those jobs. My first job in the rabbinate officially was the assistant rabbi at the Young Israel of Holliswood for Rabbi Menachem Penner. My wife and I were in the community kollel there. And so we both had chavrusas and were learning with people in the evenings. And I was also the assistant rabbi in the shul. And so I got the chance to not just learn with individuals one-on-one, but also to give shiurim and to speak and to be around him, which was an opportunity towards the future, potentially, if an opportunity presented itself to become the actual senior rabbi in a shul somewhere. So I was with him first for a couple of years as the assistant rabbi. He's phenomenal. So I learned a ton from being around him. And the assistant rabbi position is like the best of every world. You have all the opportunity to teach and to speak and none of the pressure of having to answer any of the questions that are being asked or deal with any of the situations that are being presented. But you get to be a fly on the wall for a lot of those conversations. Even before that, when I was in yeshiva, I interned at the Young Israel Flatbush where I grew up. And the Rav there, Rabbi Alman, who was my rabbi growing up, let me into a lot of rooms that I think a lot of 23-year-old, 22-year-old guys don't necessarily get into, to hear him interacting with Balabatim, to hear him interacting with other Rabbanim, to be in the room, to ask him questions as things were happening and how to handle them and how he would handle them. And so those opportunities at what you would call shimush, which was sort of apprenticeship, for lack of a better term in English, were great. And then at some point after leaving the assistant rabbi role, I wasn't teaching. I was actually working in finance, but I was still interviewing for rabbinic positions. And I landed on the role at the Young Israel of North Woodmere, which was on some level unheard of, to sort of get a senior role in a shul in the New York area, let alone the Five Towns area. That was like a good opportunity. And so we moved from Holliswood, which we loved, to North Woodmere. And we were in North Woodmere for 10 years, but I wasn't in the rabbinate for 10 years.
So before we get to that transition out of the rabbinate, what were the big values that were driving you to become a rabbi at this point? What was it that called to you from your perspective? What was it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think about it a lot because it still informs the work that I do, just in a different way. I would say a couple of things. One, I felt like I was good at the teaching and the speaking, like I had sort of an ability for it and an affinity for it as well. And I liked the prep for it too, like just sitting and learning and working through content and material was always interesting to me anyway. Making it work from beginning to end was always good. And I just enjoyed that space, the interaction with an audience in that way. And there weren't a lot of roles or a lot of opportunities that I felt like existed in the world where you had that kind of impact on people's lives day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, than the rabbinate. And teaching in the classroom, I did it, but it wasn't exactly the same vibe and energy for me that I was looking for. And so the rabbinate seemed like a great avenue for that dream to be fulfilled. And I had, I would say on some level, a little bit of a naive approach to how that worked and what that would mean and what you would be responsible for and what you'd have to do. But it just felt like the right way to go about having long-term large impact on the world and on a lot of people's lives.
Can I ask you to maybe drill down a little bit more on the distinction between the rabbinate and teaching children in the school system and the education system? Because I think it's something that a lot of people, myself included, thinking about a lot, which is that there's obviously a lot of parallels, a lot of overlap, but also some big differences. And some people could make the case that the bigger impact is to had by teaching kids who are more impressionable and at the age where they're really forming their identity. So can you try to unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, I never really wanted to be in a classroom. So like I ended up in a classroom because I needed professionally to have an opportunity to work and to get paid and to make a living. And if I wanted to end up in the rabbinate, that seemed like the right avenue to go. I thought pretty good at it. So it made a lot of sense. But the classroom for me as a student, as a kid, was not something I enjoyed. It just felt like it was very strict and very formal. And then I felt like teaching was also more formal than I wanted from a structure in terms of the way I wanted to have impact on people. I wanted it to be a little bit more free-flowing and informal. I wanted it to be a little bit wider than just content focused, at least that's how I understood and how I thought about it. And in the context of community, it felt like you're involved in way more than just teaching material. You're involved in the day-to-day of their lives. There's this I would call the spiritual side of it as opposed to the context side of it and the material side of it. And so you're in every part of their being, from the moment that maybe they have a child to the moment that they're going through something that's really difficult in their lives. And you're also getting the chance to teach and to speak. I felt like it covered more areas of ground. Then there was the communal environment where you're dealing with maybe other synagogues and other rabbanim or other faith communities or the larger world. And I didn't think that I could get that in a classroom. And so they just felt very different for me as places of opportunity and work. And the rabbinate seemed more like the one. I would say the other thing is there was an influence to some degree as well from having studied and learned at Yeshiva University. Very much I felt like at REITs, which is the rabbinical college there, that there was an emphasis back then, which is 25 years ago, on the rabbinate over teaching. Not that they didn't have people becoming teachers, but what they talked about and what they focused on and who they highlighted and who ended up speaking at the Chag HaSmicha, let's say as an example, were rabbanim, guys in the field, guys in small communities, guys out of New York and the wider world. And that's who they highlighted. And some degree, I wanted to be that, even though I probably had no right or reason to think that way. I'll give you just a great example. I sat once with Rabbi Lamb, and Rabbi Lamb is a cousin of my father. And so he and I had a chance once in a while to sit and talk about stuff. And he asked me once, what's on your mind? And I said, I'm having trouble choosing between the rabbinate and teaching. And I don't know which way to go. And he said, why do you have to choose? Let it choose itself. And I thought I didn't know that was an option, to let it choose itself. And it became apparent to me over time that even though in truth I spent many more years in the classroom than I did in the rabbinate, that where my interest lay was actually there.
Amazing. So you ended up getting this amazing role for someone your age and in the five towns, a rabbi of your own shul. And you alluded to the fact before that it didn't really work out maybe the way you dreamed or didn't last the whole tenor. So what happened there? What was the breakdown and why didn't it work out?
It was hard. It was really hard, much harder than I thought it would be, transitioning from the assistant rabbi role to the rabbi role. I don't think I was as well prepared for it as I thought I was. There were, I would say, some mechanics and some things that are going on in the community itself that I simply wasn't as well attuned to that maybe a more senior veteran rabbi might have been attuned to at that point. I think I was 28 years old at the time. And so there's an experience level that I think is really important that I just didn't have. But more than anything else, it just didn't work. It didn't work for our family. My wife was working full-time as a lawyer, and we had 2 little kids at the time we moved. And I was teaching full-time in a local high school, and I was a little bit working in finance. I had like 3 jobs at some point in the course of it, and I couldn't juggle them. And those were hard. And then the truth is I wasn't good at it, which hard to admit out loud, but I've said this many times to a lot of rabbis over the years. There was just certain aspects of it that are really important to it that I really wasn't particularly good at then, that maybe now, closing in on 50, I might be better at than I was at 28 or 29. And at some point, you have to be really honest with yourself and say, this is not working. this is not working for me. This is not working for the community. And then besides the community, it's just not working for our family. And you have to prioritize and choose, I think, in those spaces. And for me, it wasn't even a choice. I'm going to choose family, and I'm going to choose me over staying in a role, in a position, and then figure it out and try to figure out what that's going to be and whatever role that's going to be. And so just to give you an example, I always had sort of viewed the rabbinate from the standpoint of teaching and speaking. Those were my areas of interest, and those were my areas of focus. The empathy part, being the really compassionate human person who embodies the spiritual or is, that person who embodies Torah for a member of your community in those spaces, in those moments, I was really not good at. I don't know that I hadn't prepared for it. It wasn't great. So an example, there was a member of the shul, was a distant member of the shul. So she didn't come on a regular basis. I didn't really know her particularly well. And she lost a parent. It's like an older member of the community, and she lost a parent, and I had no connection with her per se. And admittedly, I just simply forgot about the Shiva. It was horrible. Afterwards, she called me out on it, and I apologized profusely. And then I called her Erev Yom Kippur to apologize again and ask for mechila. But that's a sign, I feel like, hey man, you're not paying attention here the way you need to. And you have to get honest with yourself. Either you're going to burn out, you're going to flame out, you're going to destroy your family, or the harder part of it maybe is you figure it all out and you get it together and you're able to do all those things. And that was not going to be me. And so I had to shift gears, and I shifted into organizational work at that point, because I still wanted to stay in what I would call holy work, right? Avodas HaKodesh, but I didn't want to work on Shabbos anymore. And the way to do that, I felt like was an organizational work. So I shifted from teaching and the rabbinate into organizational.
So approximately how long was this? Did you hold that position in North Woodmere, and when did you, what was the time frame?
Yeah, so I was there. I was the rabbi of the shul for 3 years. I think it was 04 to 07. It was probably the years that I did it. Maybe there, straddled into 08. And then before that, I had been the assistant rabbi in Holliswood for a few years as well. Same idea in terms of the time frame. And then I moved on in 2007, 2008. I moved into organization.
Got it. When you're talking about transitioning out of the rabbinate, leaving that role, so there's a lot to that, and you obviously had a lot of good reasons to do so. But I'm curious about the identity factor. When you are the rabbi of a shul, you have a very clear identity as a rav, and that forces you to behave a certain way and to act a certain way, dress a certain way, and you're leaving that, so you're leaving that identity behind as well. Was that something hard for you? How do you manage that?
Yeah, I described it over time as almost a little bit of a personal mourning period, because it had been a dream of mine or an idea of mine that was going to be my career, and that wasn't. And so you go through this period of change, figuring out, now who am I? When you talk about a person's identity, I've talked about this with a lot of other people as well, a lot of professionals too. You sort of have, I would say maybe three or four different spaces in which your identity is defined. There is your home life, there's your communal life, there's your professional life. And if one of those things is pulled from you, then a good portion of your identity on some level goes away. And that's really hard. And when it's a public space like that it's even harder. And at another level of it, we stayed in the community. So I left the role, but for a year, the shul didn't have a rabbi. And so I stayed on in some unofficial capacity with them. So certain simchas came along, and I officiated at a simcha, or there was a funeral and I officiated a funeral. I spoke a couple of times, and I even stayed in daven there. But you can imagine, I was no longer sitting in the rabbi's chair. I was sitting in one of the rows in the shul, and that was exceptionally hard. And so we stayed in the community for another 7 years after I left the shul. And the rav that they hired after me was phenomenal. He stayed for 15 years. He's amazing, amazing, amazing. He was really right for the role where I was really not right for that role.
Who's that?
Rabbi Yehuda Septimus, terrific rabbi, terrific rabbi. And he and I had a great relationship, still do. And so you're mourning that to some degree, and you have to figure out what does that mean? Like, what's it going to be now? And I would say some of it stays with you, because I think certain ways in which you handle yourself and certain ways in which you appear and show up at events now, even, or when you're actually still giving a talk or giving a shiur or whatever it is, that still comes with you. That doesn't leave you. I think maybe it's glossed over or it's covered over in dust at some point because you're not doing it as much. But when you shake off the dust and you polish it, it's still there. And so you have to, on some level, reimagine yourself or re-identify yourself for what that next thing is going to be. And you can't force it. I think you have to let it sort of play itself out. And over time, I realized that the larger thing that I was interested in was impact. And it was less about ultimately the role. I had to convince myself of that, I think, initially, but also come to appreciate and realize that that was true, that I was much more interested in having as wide and as large and as significant and as meaningful an impact as I could possibly have. And that could be in the rabbinate, and that could be in something else entirely. And, I think that's where I'm at now.
And do you think of that experience as a failure?
No. I think if you simply look at that inside the prism of those few years, it might look at it as a failure, but nothing exists inside the prism of those few years. It's part of the longer journey. I mean, it's a much, much bigger picture and a much, much longer story. And if I had stopped at 31 when it was over, maybe I would think that. But I learned a ton from being there. And to me, that ultimately was the biggest thing. I learned just a lot about myself. I learned a lot about family. I learned about my priorities, and I learned about just how to handle these kinds of situations. And the organizational work that I moved into at the time was synagogue related, shul related, and then national related. And so handling myself in those kinds of rooms and larger rooms with, bigger players and more impactful figures, I was prepared for, because I had been the guy in the suit and had been in those rooms and had to learn how to control emotion and how to handle just the energy of a situation. And so, no, I'm still benefiting from it. The network, just as another aspect of it, the network of people who I connected with in the rabbinate, especially there, because you're living in a very large Jewish community. And even though I was the rabbi of a smaller synagogue, it's a large Jewish community. And so you got around to a lot of people and a lot of different rabbis, a lot of different shuls and organizations within the community. And so you got to meet and know and grow with a lot of people. And those people stay with you because you did stuff for them. They did stuff for you. And so, no, it felt like a failure at the time. And while I was mourning it, it was a failure. But I think over the long term, I'm so much better off as a person for that not having gone well. I talk about this with coaching clients, the blessing of the thing that didn't happen for you. And you sometimes have this idea that a certain role or a certain thing is the thing you absolutely have to have. If you don't get it, it's a failure. And then you realize that not having that or not getting that is actually the blessing. And to me, that not working was a massive blessing because of where I am now and what I do now and where I live now and my family and their happiness. And so, no, absolutely not.
Okay, so you made reference to the fact that you transitioned to organizational work. Can you give us a little more specifics, more details about what your next move was after you realized that your dream of being a shul rabbi was not going to be long-term?
Yeah, you say that and it hurts still. Okay. But so at the time, because of the network that I had and the friends that I had in a lot of different places in organizational work and communal work. So when I made it known to some friends that I was looking to move to a different vertical in communal work, sort of the feelers were out for opportunities. And I ended up at the Orthodox Union. The OU was looking to revamp and rebuild their synagogue services program. This is why it was a benefit. Having served as a community rabbi for a number of years, having gotten around to speak and to lecture and to talk on a lot of different subjects, and having built some programs for the shul and having done a little bit of fundraising in the shul at the time, that role as leading this new revised program at the OU, which the synagogue services team, which had sort of been gone dormant for a period of time, was the right opportunity for me. And so, and the expectation level and the build level was such that, okay, we're restarting this. So we can appreciate that year one's going to be X and year two is going to be Y, and it's going to take time to get there. And so it was just the right role. So I ended up at the OU for 3 years. And then I bounced a little bit back into chinuch for a short period of time. And then I ended up at National Council of Young Israel, where I played the role of the associate executive vice president. And so I was coming into the other large Orthodox synagogue organization in a very senior role at a very young age, meeting with a lot of top great people at the world's best Jewish organizations. And I got to hang out with them and be in the room with them. And it felt like I had peered inside, the great halls of Jewish communal leadership, and I was allowed to be there. And I got to just learn and see and talk and ask questions of the best that there was in Jewish communal life, and to see what could be and what was, the opportunity and what was where I was going to go next. And so I was there for a couple of years as well. And then I moved on from there. It sort of rolled until we ended up here in Israel. And so things shifted during that time, but that was the trajectory, was Jewish communal life, Jewish communal leadership from the organizational standpoint, as opposed to the educational or the synagogue.
Right. I mean, another way to think about it and to frame it, as you've been mentioning before, is that you started out as a rabbi, but you also had this finance role and experience. And so maybe the two tracks of one being someone who wants to make an impact and inspire and be a source of holiness and help to the Jewish community on the one hand. On the other hand, there's the level of the business skills, the management, the leadership, all of those things. So did you think of that latter category as just a means to the ends of making an impact, or was it something more about your personality, your skills, your passions that really wanted to express those sort of more secular, business-minded skill sets?
Yeah, I always liked business. I just wasn't working in it, let's say, and I didn't see myself being able to work in it on a consistent day-to-day basis. And even though I had when I left teaching and I was working in finance, so I was working at IDT in Newark, New Jersey at the time, and I was on a very small team in the finance group, and I liked it. But like there was some sort of nagging vibe that something was missing. But I liked it. I liked the business. I liked the interaction. I liked the people. I liked the thinking. And the numbers were always interesting to me on some level. Even when I was in the rabbinate and I would ask about the shul's finances, that was like crossing a line a little bit. But I was always curious about how we were doing financially. It's always interesting to me. But it didn't come out per se until I moved into more of a space of the fundraising world and really appreciating what it takes and what it was necessary for things to actually happen in the world. I had led teams at the OU. I built a team at the OU. I'd led the team at National Council. I had a small team when I was at Yeshivat Shalavim as the fundraiser, and I had a small team when I moved into tech, into coaching. So that leadership piece was always sort of something around me, and so it was interesting to me. It's still something that I talk about, think about, on a week-to-week basis, basically at this point. And so they were all interesting to me all the time. I just didn't know how they all fit together. They didn't always seem like they fit together. They really felt like they were two disparate parts of my being. The ability to find a way to make those things unite in some way and to get sort of a congruence between all the different aspects of myself made life much, much easier. And so that happened only years later, but that's how I sort of thought. I was like, okay, so I'm interested. And so when I talk to people at a Shabbos table, I can ask some good questions and it's interesting to me and it's real. But at the same time, like, that's not what I do on a day-to-day basis, and I'm happy not doing that on a day-to-day basis.
Right. It's interesting because a lot of people listening to this podcast, a lot of B'nai Torah, so there is maybe I think a smaller minority group who they'll say, the only thing I care about, the only thing I want to do is to learn and to teach and to be a rabbi, and nothing else matters to me. I don't care about any of these other things. But a lot of people, they do have an interest, a love, a passion, connection to the worlds of business, the worlds of finance, the worlds of marketing, all of these things. For those people, so to find a sort of role like you have in the Jewish organizational role could be a really perfect synergy of combining those two aspects of their life. So who should or shouldn't be thinking about such a move? Who is going to do well in such a role? Who's not going to do well?
Yeah. So I would, just on your point, just to add on to that, I think you're right. And it's hard for some to find the sipuk hanefesh in quote unquote, just being in finance or just being a lawyer or just being in tech or whatever that is, because they want to be learning and they have to learn how to balance that. I remember for years when I was working at Shalavim as the fundraiser, so one of the Rebbeim, the Rav Yamer, talked a lot about the idea of what he called the broad life, the idea that all those things fit in some way into Torah, and you have to figure out how they fit in and how you can make those things feel right for you, as opposed to feeling uncomfortable every day of your life when you go to work, when you want to be rabbi in yeshiva or whatever that is. You have to find that niche. And I have this conversation a lot with rabbis and mechanchim who are looking to make aliyah to figure out how they're going to make it work financially here. And maybe that's not going to be their focus. And how do they work through that problem or that struggle to be able to make that balance work? And I think what I think with people, younger people in that space, is they really have to be honest with what they're going to be okay with and where they're going to thrive as human beings. And so I have some really good friends who are, they're business guys, and they're paradigms and paragons of excellence in every aspect of their lives. And worst case scenario that a person should live their life to be like that kind of a person who learns and is, is always involved in the community and is doing mitzvahs all the time and loves life and loves Torah and loves HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And at the same time, they work, 12, 14, 16 hours a day in law and finance and real estate and all these other things. And I think there's that long struggle with yourself to figure out how that works. And at the same time, you're paying attention to, okay, what am I good at? And what is interesting to me? And what do I want to spend some time focusing on? And obviously knowing that you don't know now what you're going to know in 5 years from now about it. And so there's a process and a progression that you're going to get to over time. But I think that piece of it also is hard for people is to pay attention, to really pay attention to themselves as to what they're doing, what they're focused on, that's best for them, that's not best for somebody else who's trying to live vicariously through them. And to give you an example on that, when I was the rabbi in the shul, there was a family there that had a son who went to yeshiva, and he wanted to just sit and learn for a little while. And the parents were adamantly and vehemently opposed. And this was one of the moments that wasn't a great rabbinic moment, but it really worked out for them. I had a conversation with them and I said, the reason you don't want him to sit and learn is because of him or because of you. And no parent wants to hear that from anybody, let alone their rabbi. But it was, and I often struggle with having the nuanced conversation, which I'm better at with coaching now. And they realized that it was them, not him. That for him, this was the best thing. For them, this was not, but those two things are not the same thing. And they're all very happy together now as a family, but this was what was right for him. So and for ourselves, we have to think about what's right for us. And yes, sometimes it doesn't work. You have to do something you don't want to do. You take a job you don't want to take because it pays the bills. And yes, but it's always hard because you're in flux or you're uncomfortable at every moment in the work. And sometimes you know why and sometimes you don't. And that, I think, is really important for anyone in any field to figure out what that's going to be.
Got it. And as far as the life in the Jewish organizations and how that works out, so what are your summer takeaways as to who would be a good fit for those type of roles and who is not a good fit?
It's a really good question. It's funny because I as I said, I didn't end up in it, like I would say, organically or naturally, in the sense that I wasn't like my target from the beginning. I know one or two guys who from the start in their time sitting and learning were going to be organizational guys, but it was like unheard of at the time that a person would go and be, sit and learn for 5 years, get smicha, and then not be a teacher and not be a rav, but go into organizational work. I think now it's more of that. And I think that that's part of that is earlier on, if you're able to identify where your strengths lie and where your weaknesses lie, what you're okay with, what you're willing to work through. It's not different than anything else that I think a person is going through where they're putting their time and their efforts into something new that they're trying to study and to learn. Is it interesting to me? Is this something that I want to pursue? Is this, am I over my skis here and this is too far afield for me and I don't get it? And the ability to learn some of those things early and figure that stuff out early, A, saves you a lot of pain later on, and B, gets you on a path that's better. There was a friend of mine in yeshiva who spent a year as the assistant rabbi in a shul in New York City. And after 3 months realized this isn't for me. And so before he had finished smicha, he had already known that he was shifting gears. And I think he saved himself years of heartache and pain and difficulty and stress and struggle, which I'm not saying I needed to avoid, but in his case, he definitely needed to and wanted to desperately avoid it. And he is a very successful human being and did not have to go through that and didn't want to go through that. And I jokingly used to tell someone at Yeshiva University, if you have a guy who's on the fence about his career in terms of the rabbinate versus education versus organization, send him my way. I said, because we'll have let's have a really honest, open conversation about all the things that no one else wants to say to you and ask you. And that's why, for me, coaching works from a professional standpoint, because I ask a lot of the questions that nobody else wants to ask that make rooms incredibly uncomfortable, but get out the answers and the conversations that need to have happen. I've done that with guys who either were looking at an aspect in communal work and whatever work that was going to be, or had the conversation with people about making aliyah in terms of, and then ultimately deciding maybe now is not the time. I even had it when I was at one of the organizations with a shul that was considering going Orthodox. It's a crazy story years ago. This is a shul that was in flux somewhere in the Northeast. They weren't sure what to do with themselves, what direction to go in. They realized that strategically, from a real estate standpoint, they were in a good place. It was affordable to live there. They were close enough to enough kosher amenities, whatever they needed for religious people. They were considering going Orthodox. And someone sent me to them to have a conversation. I had a conversation with the entire shul, everybody everyone. And I asked them some really hard questions about why they wanted to do that, what that would mean, and then to play it forward. Like, what does it mean in 5 years from now for you? What does it look like? Play this out for me 5 years from now. What does your Shabbat morning look like in this shul when you go Orthodox, right? As an example. And they did that. And they realized they didn't want to do it. They didn't like, for their perspective, they didn't like how that image looked and what that would mean for them and how that would make them feel inside their own community after building this place for 50, 60, 100 years. And they didn't do it. But it's because they had a really hard, honest, open conversation that was not naive, that was uncovering the muck and the dirt and the difficult. And those are the best conversations to have out front. And I do that now on a consistent basis in coaching.
So I do want to hear a little more about your coaching, but before we get
Sure.
to that chapter, I wanted to ask you one more question about one of the very interesting roles that you've held in this organizational phase of your life or part of your life, which is CauseMatch, which is obviously these platforms are quite ubiquitous, and maybe we're even seeing signs that people are a little bit, trying to, maybe there's even a shift past that because it's maybe already getting to be too much. But maybe just tell us about your role in building CauseMatch. At what point did you come on, and how did that develop?
Yeah, so CauseMatch, for people who are not paying attention necessarily in the Jewish community, perhaps, is an online fundraising platform that helps organizations raise more money using tech and using smarts around how to raise money, particularly in what's called peer-to-peer, which is getting people on board to help raise money to widen the network and the audience of the organization in terms of potential supporters. And I joined the company at a fairly early stage. I think I was maybe employee 10 or 11. We sat around one table in the building in Mass Challenge in Jerusalem. And I joined after having been at a couple of organizations here already. And it felt like I was on a hamster wheel, that I was going to be an executive director at one, and then an executive director at another, and then another, and another. It was never going to end, and I was going to be miserable. I needed to stop and say, like, enough. But like, how do you transition out of the nonprofit world or the organizational world at that stage of your life? And so I started to interview for business opportunities, for profit opportunities. I was trying to spin my resume to have it make sense to people in specific roles. And I found that I had already been pigeonholed into a specific box, and like, how you get out of that. And one friend said, he goes, you just need one job that gets you out and gets you across. And so at the time I had a friend who was going to CauseMatch in a role. And he said to me, come with me to CauseMatch. I'm like, in what capacity? He's like, I need someone to play the role of coach. And I'm like, I don't even know what did that even mean? Like, I didn't even know what that meant at the time. The only coaches I had known were sports coaches, right? People who had had coached, or I had coached, or whatever it was. I coached Little League in America. I had coached like something else, but like, I didn't know what a coach was. And so I was like, okay, I don't know how to do this, but let me look at the job description. I looked at the job description. I met with leadership, and I came in as a coach on the team. My role was like sort of a perfect role. My role was to explain the technology to leadership at organizations and help them through the process of using these kinds of tools to be able to raise more money for their organizations. There was, at the time, a lot of hesitance, and there was a lot of discomfort around tech, let alone this kind of tech in their fundraising. They knew what they knew how to do it, and this was completely different. And so having a person who lived in the space between the tech and the organization, which is where I lived in the coaching space at the time, was really meaningful to people, because I would walk into a room or onto a Zoom or a conversation, and they felt, okay, this guy had been in the rabbinate, he had been in education, he had been in fundraising, he had done the one-on-ones, he had done the events, he had done capital, he had done operational. He knows us, and we know him. And so that conversation was so there was a comfort level there right away. And so for 4.5 years, I was at the company, and I started as a coach. There was no coaching team. I was a coach, and then I became the head of coaching in the team. And then I started to write curriculum at the company for outside people who were learning how to coach. And so I coached coaches and I coached organizations. And in the course of 4.5 years, on some level, it shifted for me professionally. I wasn't like paying attention to it, let's say. Now I can't say that I'm viewed as a nonprofit guy, let's say, because at this point I'm not independent and I work for myself and I have clients in the nonprofit space, but I have my own sort of niche that I'm working on. And so I spent 4.5 years there, worked on, I think, 200 or so campaigns for organizations over the 4.5 years. And, it was in the neighborhood of like $50 million between those campaigns and organizations, all walks of life, all places around the world, multiple languages, and really helping to make that process work for a lot of people. And it's still a real source of pride for me when I see organizations still using the technology or using my terminology and language to help them succeed, because it means it's still sort of paying itself forward on some level. The term I use is compounded impact. The impact is still there and it's still growing, even though I'm no longer directly involved in it on a day-to-day basis.
But you did mention that now your main focus is on coaching. And you also mentioned that, originally you thought coaching was for the local football team or baseball team. And now we seem to have come to a place where coaching is almost, I don't know, it's gotten pretty cheap. Like you see almost anybody who can call themselves a coach these days. So how do you think about that dynamic? Who should or shouldn't be a coach? What type of problems should people be approaching coaches for and not be approaching coaches for? So what's your take on that landscape?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the truth is, there's no formal official thing that you need to call yourself a coach. It's at this time, unless you really want to study it and know it. The best coach who I've ever read about is a gentleman named Bill Johnson, who was known as the $1 trillion coach. And he was a football coach who ended up in business and then ended up coaching the world's greatest CEOs of all time. I don't think he had any formal training in what you might call executive and leadership coaching, but he was a football guy. And the book about him is unbelievable, called The $1 Trillion Coach. I recommend it. Anyway, so and when I started, I wasn't trained as a coach either. I had no idea what I was doing. And then I had a conversation with someone who was my coach, and he put it into a frame, which was, he said, you don't realize you've been coaching all along. You just didn't call yourself a coach. And so when you're teaching in a high school, or you're the rabbi in a community, or you're an organizational leader, and you're sitting with a leader from another organization, they're coming to you for advice and they have a question and they're thinking it through. They're relying on you, not simply as an advisor, as a counselor. On some level, there's a coaching piece to it. What I say a lot of the time, and it's not a nice thing to say, but I say it a lot, is most people who call themselves coaches don't actually coach, because it's not the same thing. And I'm a little bit of I don't call myself a snob about it, but a little bit of a snob. I did spend some time studying, and I did study with some coaches. I did take a long formal program in coaching to get certified as a coach. I thought it was important to have a sort of a pathway in how I think about these things and how I work with people. And at the same time, I can begin to appreciate the nuanced difference between a coach, consultant, a trainer, things like that. And they're not exactly the same thing. And so when I was at Cosmat, one of the things I did, I was coaching potential other coaches. They had a program, partnership program, people outside the company who were consultants in their day-to-day who wanted to learn coaching for nonprofits. And since I was the guy in the team as the head of coaching, I was training them to be coaches. And there was one or two people who I was working with who couldn't be a coach. They needed to do the work. And what I mean by that is when I'm doing coaching, I'm asking all the right questions and I'm pushing people maybe to do things they don't want to do. I'm not actually the one doing the physical work, the tasks day to day. And if you feel like you need to be the one doing the work in a project, then you're not a coach. You're either a contractor or you're a consultant or you're a trainer, but you're not a coach. And if you're providing them with the answers all the time, then you're an advisor and a counselor. You're, Yitro in terms of Moshe in that space, but you're not a coach. And so there are real differences in that. And I think it's important for people sometimes to appreciate that the person that they're speaking to isn't a coach. It's someone who they're going to for advice. If you're going to for the person for advice, they give you advice, they're not coaching you, they're counseling you. That's a completely different thing. And I think it's important. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is helping people pull out the answers from themselves. I'm putting them into the frame of the conversation. I'm laying out options for them. I'm not deciding for them. And I'm helping them elicit the answers that they feel like they need. And at the same time, I'm a bit of a cheerleader because I'm trying to get them to do things that they're not comfortable with, to push themselves to do things that they're not willing yet to try, so that they can get to where they want to be and to be the most successful version of themselves. And so it's not for everyone, I think, coaching. I think if you still want to be in the day-to-day work of it, then do multiple things, coach and also consult or contract, which is what I do. I do a mix of the three. And the fourth thing also, that's the mix. So I coach, individual leaders and groups of leaders. I consult on projects for organizations, and I'll give you the quip for it in just a second. And then I also do contract work. I'm actually in the day-to-day work of an organization, doing specific things and tasks for them to help them get to where they want to be. Those three things are very different. So what I always say is, you coach people, you consult problems. And that comes from that book. That's the main thing. You coach people, you're working with the person, you consult the problem. There's a problem, there's an issue, there's something, there's a struggle, whatever it is, that's consulting. And those are not the same.
Got it. So in addition to all those other things, you also have time to do a podcast. So do you want to just give a quick pitch for your podcast? What is it and who should be tuning in?
Yeah, I actually do two. I just started another one a couple of weeks ago. So the first one is called Coaching the Bible, which is a mix for me between learning Torah and learning leadership at the same time. And I've been doing that I'm now in season 5. This is year 5. So it follows the weekly parsha, basically, week to week, and trying to explore the origins of what I call a leadership principle or business principle from its Torah biblical roots, and to apply those things. They're timeless. It started with the idea that I was getting a little bit, I don't know, I would say bored is not the right term, with, Shnai Mikra on a week-to-week basis. And I needed something that was going to drive me. It used to be, I would pick another sefer every year. And I had an interest in starting something. I felt like I needed to get some content out. I don't know what it was. So something internally, I just needed, like, on a weekly basis to produce. And so the podcast was the avenue. And so on some level, the people who listen, they're benefiting mostly me. I don't know that I'm benefiting them at all. And so, so over the course of 200 plus episodes at this point, we're covering anything from empathy to compassion to strategic, business approaches. This year, so all of Breshit this year was about decision-making, different aspects, and thinking about how people make decisions, using the characters in Breshit to understand how they made the decision, why they decided to do what they did, why they decided not to do something else, and appreciating that not just from the inside the story, which maybe is in and of itself interesting, but also from the standpoint of you as a leader in your community, your home, your business, whatever that may be. So that's still going. That's one. The second one I just started a few weeks ago was more of a professional pursuit with a former colleague of mine at Cosmos named Rami Rubin, and we talk about everything within the world of good. So we're looking at the different ecosystems and different aspects of the world of good, philanthropy, fundraising, organizations, leaders, founders, stuff like that. And we're just talking about a lot of the issues. We're going to start bringing on guests to talk to them about their experiences as leaders and as founders, their struggles, their pains, their wins. And so that's been really interesting in the last few weeks, just because we both felt like that was something we wanted to do. There's obviously potentially a professional benefit in starting something like that at this time in the world. And we felt like there was a niche that we could perhaps speak to. And so I'm doing 2 at the moment.
Amazing. Okay, so let's wrap up with our lightning round. Yeah. Where in the winter, we have these long Friday nights. So what's your favorite way of using that long time after the Friday night Suda?
So I have to say, the first thing I do is I do all the dishes. So it's an important thing to mention here is, and I want to say so that when my family listens to this, they know that I know that every Friday night, I'm the one who's doing dishes, and I've been doing for years, the dishes on Friday night. So that's the first thing I do is that. And then typically speaking, it's if I'm inside a good book, so I'll do that. For many, many years, it was a long night that I had for myself, hours and hours within, either it was most often was parsha related svarim, just, nibbling at a certain issue or trying to understand something. So it's hours and hours of learning. I do most of my learning on Shabbos, and I get I feel like a very fulfilled and filled up with that. So yeah, love a long Friday night.
Amazing. And you mentioned before your favorite coaching book, The $1 Trillion Coach. What's your favorite Parsha Sefer? Is there one that has a particular relevance to your coaching and your leadership roles?
No, none of that. The one that I knew that this was a question that was coming. I had to really think about it because for a long time I used to do when I was in the rabbinate, I would do one new parish a year. So I would do the parsha, I would do Rashi, and then I would add on another. And when I was in the rabbi in the shul, so every short Torah that I would give before laning was from that new sefer. So that over the course of many years, I would get through a lot of mefarshim. How else are you going to get through them, right? And then I hit on 2. So I'll give you two. One was the Bar Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Salant, which Rabbi Ari Leibowitz introduced me to many years ago, and just love that sefer. Just the weaving and the mixing of content and creativity, and both on the pshat level and on the drush level, phenomenal work. And then the other one, which I've been learning, I think, consistently for 30 years at this point, is the Nesiva Shalom, which is just working on a different plane for me in terms of, the Hasidic and the spiritual plane, and looking at those same psukim from a completely different vantage point. So those two have sustained me for a long time. And then I'm always looking at something new. So the last couple of years, Steinsaltz has a great work on the weekly Parsha. This one called the Nefesh Shel Parsha, I think it's called, of Chagai London, which is like a set of them. You might have it on yourself. You're looking for it. Nefesh Shel Parsha, I think it's called. So it's like 4 or 5 different volumes on Parsha, and then also on some of the Megillas. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Parsha Shel Nefesh. Okay, got it wrong. Okay, amazing. So that has been, and I love that sort of newish Rosh Hashiva Israel vibe, which is new to me. And so it's been really interesting.
Amazing. And final question, if you were forced to choose a job, any job in a role in industry that you haven't yet been in, what would it be?
It would be probably coaching basketball. I think, to give you the example, my son played, one of my sons plays a lot of basketball, and he always jokes that, like, I'm a different person when it comes to basketball. When I'm at his games and I'm talking basketball with him, it's just a different aspect of my being. I'm not a crazy, rowdy, yelling at the refs kind of a fan, and I'm not yelling at him either. That's not me as a person. But in terms of just paying attention and following the game and being interested in the game and each side of the coaching, if I could coach basketball at a high level, I think I would enjoy that tremendously.
Okay, amazing. Bini Maryles, thank you so much for all your insights today.
Thank you. Pleasure being here. Thanks so much.